Fischbacher first, and then Michael Mays. Urs Fischbacher, of course, everyone who knows him knows everything. And for the others, he is really one of the great pioneers of the experimental economics discipline. And he is one of the persons responsible, or whom we have to be grateful for setting certain standards in the methodology and the use of lab experiments that has helped us to come up with comparable and worldwide accepted experimental treatments and conditions and settings. And this is a great paper which I thought was published more recently, but it's from 2012 in Restart. And thank you very much for being with us, and we'll have a little break after this double session.
Okay. Thank you. Is it okay with the sound, or is it? For me, it sounds a little bit strange, but it's probably more comfortable for everybody. Okay. What I'd like to talk. So my initial talk was theory and evidence on the assessment of intention and responsibility, which is perhaps a little peculiar title. I think it's more or less. It's about determinants of reciprocal behavior. And there are these two aspects, these two facets of the assessment of reciprocal behavior, which is intention and responsibility. But I'd like to start with a short overview of key empirical results on social preferences. You have heard a lot on social preferences so far. I would just add a little bit, not my personal perspective, but a little bit how I would organize it and what I consider as key, and to set stage for what I would do then. Then I will talk a little bit about theories of social preferences. Also here I will just give a very short overview of what I consider as important. And then I will go to what I promised in the title, to the determinants of reciprocal behavior. When we think about key evidence of social preferences, my view is a quite experimental view, in the sense that I think about how do we measure social preferences and what kind of situation do we look at. And then I see, let's say, kind of three layers that are the most important ones, which is outcome-oriented preferences, with what you can just measure if one person decides about how to come up with a certain outcome. So that's usually measured in dictator gate. Then reciprocity, which is just usually the bilateral situation. One person reacts to another person. So first we have no reaction, second we have reaction, and in the third case it's a little bit, it's a more complicated behavior in that sense that the third party responds to what happened in an interaction of two other people. When we look at outcome-oriented preferences, we know that people are pro-social, that people are competitive, and there is heterogeneity, and I think a key element of human social behavior is heterogeneity. That's definitely important, and I think you have heard a lot. One thing, what you measure with social value orientation is exactly that. And then there is the question, what kind of elements are crucial? How stable these preferences are, and so on and so on. Second kind of behavior that's very prominent, in particular because a prominent theory has been developed based on that, is inequity aversion, that people just do not have a pro-social behavior or a competitive behavior, but it depends on the circumstances. So, for instance, they want to keep inequality small, which means that if they are behind, they are not so nice. If they are ahead, they are nice. So that's outcome-oriented preferences. So there is a lot of evidence, and as I said, one way to systemize that is social value orientation. Reciprocity falls, according to my view, in two parts. Positive reciprocity, which means that you are nice to nice people. And so the classical experiment is the trust game. Please, if you do not understand something or do not know a game or so, please ask. So I assume that you are more or less familiar with that, but just if you don't, please let me know. It's usually quickly explained and helpful for the following explanations. As I said, trust game, a person can invest, second person can return. What happens is that people return contrary to selfishness, and for that reason people invest. And the behavior of the first person is considered as trust. It's trust in reciprocation. Actually, very similar game, the gift exchange game, that's just essentially a kind of trust game in the labor market. Interestingly, I think there are a couple of people who think they have invested the trust game. I think the people who have invested the gift exchange game all think that they have invested the trust game. Actually, the advantage of the inventors of the trust game, Beckley and McCabe, is that they called it really trust game, contrary to the crowd of Fertig, Steiger and Riedel, who called it gift exchange game. And but you do not observe this positive reciprocity, this reward of kind behavior in bilateral situations, but also in, for instance, public goods game, where conditional cooperation is an abundant phenomenon. So if you experience high cooperation, it's likely that the person is also conditional cooperators. But also here, we have, of course, a lot of heterogeneity, and not everybody is conditional cooperative. There are a lot of people who are selfish. On the negative side, what I mean here is that people also punish not so nice behavior. And the most famous game is, of course, the ultimatum game. I think everybody knows that. We observe that people reject unfair offers. But we can actually implement punishment stages in different contexts. For instance, it has been quite popular to introduce it in public goods game, which boosts contributions in these games, usually. So that's what we observe in reciprocity. So essentially, we see that people reward kind and punish unkind behavior. Finally, I want just to mention, kind of for completeness, third-party behavior, famous experiments that have investigated that is indirect reciprocity. But here we have to be a little bit more careful, because indirect reciprocity can mean different things. What I mean here is the classical indirect reciprocity, where A can help B, and then another person can help A, knowing the reputation of A. So the indirect element goes somewhat backwards. So people help each other knowing how they helped in the past. That's usually repeated. Actually, it's usually repeated, so that also C can gain reputation. So there is also notion of generalized reciprocity. I think that it's not so clear how this kind of reciprocal behavior is called. One way is to call it generalized reciprocity, which means that if A helps B, then B is more likely to help another person, which essentially means, or one interpretation is that, B knows that the group is more cooperative and for that reason cooperates. It's more the evolutionary interpretation. Let's say a psychological interpretation would be, if you are helped, then you are in a better mood and for that reason more willing to help. Finally, Also with respect to punishment, you observe third-party punishment, so that means that people also punish people for actions in which they were not involved. So let's say you can be nice to him, you were not nice, he can punish you, and some people do. So that's, let's say, this third layer of social preferences that we observe. Now, when we look at this kind of behavior, this kind of behavior are interesting because they violate standard assumption of economic theory. I'm actually do not agree that behavioral economics is completely mainstream. I think there is still a kind of mainstream economics, but anyhow, even if there is not, there is a standard model which assumes rationality and selfishness. And these observations are interesting when they are in violation of rationality and selfishness, so the joint assumption. What's not in violation to rationality and selfishness is, for instance, high offers in the ultimatum game. You're really stupid if you make a really low offer, because the offer will be rejected and you will earn nothing. That's definitely stupid. And for that reason, high offers in the ultimatum game are not irrational and or are not necessarily not selfish. So they can be completely in line with standard prediction. The same is true for generosity in indirect reciprocity games. So if you help others for the sake of your reputation, that's completely rational, it makes sense, it pays off, except at the end. And actually that's the key point in most of the experiments. The truth is actually at the end. So we really have to go for the end, and that's also the case, for instance, in the trust game. It's not astonishing that people trust if usually people pay back. It's astonishing that people pay back even in a situation, even in a one-shot situation. So that's the astonishing thing and the thing that has to be explained. Now, when we think about how can we explain it, we have to abandon one of these assumptions. We have to abandon either rationality or selfishness. There are ideas that people make high offers in the ultimatum game and reject low offers that are based on bounded rationality. I consider these theories as not very convincing, at least at the psychological level. So I think Herb convincingly made the point clear that we have to make a distinction between irrationality and non-selfish behavior. And I think, for instance, rejections in the ultimatum game are really not plausible, that people reject low offers because they do not understand. At least if you tell people, didn't you see that 1 franc is more than 0? Then most people will say, yes, of course, but that's unfair. So that's essentially probably not a good explanation here. I do not say that all things that we observe here are rational and only driven by social preferences. There is evidence, for instance, in public goods game, that people contribute also because they are confused. For instance, in a public good game, Kurzbanhauser did an experiment in which they let people play a public good game, one group, and then they let other people play against this history. They played just against this history, so they got to know how much they contributed, they earned corresponding to what they contributed, but the others were not affected by this payoff. But there was some kind of history, corporations went down, and people contributed. And in that case, contributing is really, not contributing is really a dominant strategy. It really does not make sense. You cannot influence the history, because the history is past. It's really history. And you cannot help the others because it's really, there is no payoff for the other, and still people give. So there is a bounded rationality element in some of the experiments, so we have to be careful in that respect. But I think there is a huge amount of what we have to explain using change in the preferences. So the assumption of non-selfish non-selfish preferences is really crucial. I see that most theories can be organized according to principles. There are outcome-oriented models and reciprocity models. There are, of course, also combinations, but at least we can say there are a class of models that are just outcome-oriented and make a very simple assumption. This assumption is, people care not only about the own payoff, but also about the payoff of the other. So that's a very simple assumption, and that's game theoretically very nice. These models are very nice because you can implement them very simply in any game. What you have to do is just transform the payoffs at the end, and then you can apply standard game theory. It's not always trivial, but in principle it's completely trivial. You can apply standard game theory method. What these games do is, or what these models assume, is that people differ in their behavior with respect, so they have a utility that they derive from the payoff. So here is the payoff, here is the utility, and the utility that they have from the payoff differs. Yeah. And now the question is, how does this utility depend on the payoffs that they receive in the game? Yeah, you want to? No. There are a couple of ideas. For instance, Bolton and Oakenfels introduced the idea that people care about the share they have of the total payoff. Schmidt thought, okay, people care about how much they have in comparison to all other people. Charles and Rabin introduced explicitly that people care about efficiency, that means about the total payoff, which is not exactly efficiency, but I will use it as a synonym, so they care about the total payoff people gain. And they care about the poor, in the sense they could just care about the minimum payoff that is available. Now the question is, how do people care? Now it's again related to social value orientation. You can care positively about the payoffs of the others, so you like that others have income, you can dislike that others have payoff, status seeking, and let's say the most popular assumption is that it's okay when people have less than you actually are willing to give, and otherwise you are more envious and do not like it that much, and that was introduced by the very popular models of Bolton, Oakenfels and Schmidt. The models are somewhat, you heard of Schmidt? Who has heard of Schmidt? Not heard of Schmidt? Okay, just to set. So at the conference in, I think it was 97, Bolton and Oakenfels as well as Schmidt presented at the conference models, two models. Actually, same idea, people care about the inequality. And then there was some competition going on. I do not talk too much about the competition, but the crucial idea was that they introduced this. It was not new that they introduced distinction between payoff and utility in games, but they had a very simple construct. So they just assumed, Bolton Oakenfels just assumed people care about the own payoff and the share they have from the total income. And Schmidt have the assumption that people care about the own payoff and they care about how much they have more than the others and how much they have less than the others. And they care more about when they have less than when they have more. The theories were very popular. I know that Herb didn't like them that much. But actually, I also didn't like them that much. But yes?
I don't think Ernst liked it that much either. I'm not sure about the class.
Yeah, let's say until it was published, he defended it very vividly, let's say. So, but later we did a couple of studies jointly where we showed the limits of these models. So I think he was aware of the limits of the model. But the point was, so what was considered as a strength of this model, that the strength was that they can explain why people are fair in some situations, or why the outcome of situation can be fair in one situation and very unfair in another situation, even though people are the same. People are fair-minded in both situations, and both papers really emphasized that they can explain why people are, for instance, fair in the ultimatum game, or why the outcomes are fair in the ultimatum game and unfair in competition. And the reason is very simple. A prototypical situation is one person can make an offer to, let's say, all of you, and if anybody accepts the offer, then Herb, let's say, gets his payoff, and otherwise everybody gets nothing. And just one is randomly selected if more than one accepts it. Now, it's clear if he makes, let's say, 1 franc offer of 100, and now you think whether you should accept it or not in an ultimatum game, it's clear, no. Probably nobody would accept that. But now if you think that perhaps there is one in the audience who accepts that offer, then it doesn't make sense to reject it. And for that reason, even more people are willing to accept that, and for that reason, you might end up with accepting that. And that's the reason why in competition you lose the power to enforce fairness, and that was definitely a strength of the inequity aversion models. And the important thing is they could explain it with the same distribution of parameters, so the same population of fair-minded people. Now there are limits of the theory. My personal favorite of the problem is illustrated in the following situation. Here we have a kind of ultimatum game, a small ultimatum game, mini ultimatum game, in which first mover can make either an A2 offer or a fair offer. So very stylized, so fair or unfair, that's the choice. And then second person can accept or reject. Now when we look at these A2 offers, there are a lot of rejections here. And now the explanation of Fair-Schmidt is, or of Bolton-Ockenfels is, 2 is smaller than 8, and for that reason you reject it. Now look at this game here, where we have here an A2 offer and here a 10-0 offer. And these are the only options that the person has. In that case, actually A2 is nice. So why should you reject it? So the question is what you compare. Do you compare this A2? But if you compare A2, so this subgame is exactly the same as this subgame. If you have outcome-oriented preferences, so if the preferences are only generated by change of the payoffs down here, then of course you have to reject this offer as well. It doesn't make sense to differentiate. But of course, people do differentiate, and what you see here is just the rejection rates for the 8-2 offer if the alternative is 5-5, and for the A2 offer if the alternative is 10-0. And then there were 2 additional situations, one situation in which it was 8-8, A2, A2, so actually that was no alternative, so why should you reject that? That was a little bit higher, so here it was actually nice A2, here he didn't have a choice, for that reason a little bit more rejections, people are envious, makes sense. And here is the offer A2 to 8. So the alternative is either I get the big cake or he gets the big cake. And then if you get the small apple, let's say, then you're saying, okay, what should he have done? And we have higher rejection rate than if there was no alternative, but definitely also lower rejection rate than with 5-5. I think it's a nice experiment that illustrates very clear limits of these outcome-oriented models. Actually, when you think of this experiment, you can also use it to investigate whether people care about the intention that is behind a particular offer, or whether people just care only about the outcomes. And so, that's just the other data, so the rejection of the alternative and the choice of the A2. I will come back to this graphic. But what I wanted to point out is then that people thought, okay, we can actually try whether other species care about intentions. And so the game was replicated with chimpanzees. Actually, it's a little bit off topic in some sense. Now I'm not with you, perhaps you can use it tomorrow when you talk about the evolution of social preferences. But I think it's more, I think it's methodologically interesting in the sense that they just use this experiment to investigate whether chimpanzees care about intentions. They implement it slightly differently, but from the idea the same. So there is one monkey who can just draw one of his drawers, and then this second monkey has the possibility to, in that sense, get it sufficiently. So he makes a selection and he makes the acceptance. There can be a debate about whether this is a good implementation of the ultimatum game. Chimpanzees reject sometimes food. Here it's perhaps a little bit too tempting for them, because what we see, white bars, humans in Zurich, and that's chimpanzees. What we see is essentially they did not reject. They just didn't reject. Now can we infer from that they do not care about intention? Unfortunately, not really, because they are just selfish. So they just accept it always. We could have, what would we have needed to show that they do not care about intention? They should have rejected, but at the same level. So the result is interesting, but we cannot make the inference that was in the end what was thought of at the beginning, that we could show that. So that's just a little bit sidetracked. Now, when we come to non-outcome oriented theories, then they are usually based on reciprocity. So that people reward kind behavior and punish unkind behavior. And the question is now, what is unkind and what is kind? And there are a lot of concepts, and I will talk about these concepts a little bit more in the rest of the talk. What is kind or unkind? One thing that's nice or not so nice is just outcome. Actually, people could just care about outcome, and we have seen people care about outcome. But people could also care about intention, and there I now use the term very vaguely, in the sense that I just use it in the form, there is something that is not really outcome oriented. So there is an additional element, and I will give a more specific idea of what I think is really intention later in the talk. But now I want just to point out how intentions have been formalized. There are actually two ways. One way is introduced by Rabin. He just said, okay, if you have a set of alternatives, one is nice for you and one is bad for you, and someone chooses the nice one for you, then he has a good intention. Now, if this same alternative is in a package of even better alternatives, then it's not a nice intention. So the intention depends on the alternative that you choose, comparing the available set of alternatives. Sorry. Levine, Levine has a different idea. He thinks that people care about the type of the person. So if I am not kind to a particular action, but I reward nice people. And that's essentially the idea for Levine. I will explain the model a little bit more in detail. A third concept is accountability. So it's essentially how much did the person actually affect the payoff? How much was the person responsible for a particular outcome? And if the person is not at all responsible for an outcome, for instance, because it's randomly generated, then the person should neither be rewarded nor punished for this outcome. So we are now going to go a little bit more in detail in this question, and actually I will address the question, what is blameworthy? So what deserves punishment? Actually, side remark, reciprocity has these two sides, reward and punishment. When you implement reward and punishment, there is a clear asymmetry in the two. And when you look at the game that we did, this A2 game, there was always the same alternative, but there were different intentions behind, and there were very different punishment patterns. Now, there are many experiments that try to investigate how far outcome-oriented models can go, how well they work. Interestingly, they usually do not work well in the domain of negative reciprocity. People differentiate there quite well. It's not so clear in the domain of positive reciprocity, and one reason is that if you, in a trust game, if you are nice, then it's not clear whether you deserve reward. Because perhaps you are just nice in order to get reward. And for that reason, it's not so clear whether you were really nice. And there is this strong asymmetry, and for that reason, people are much more differentiated when they assign punishment. Yeah?
It's also not clear if you give the other person something, maybe you want them to have it.
Sorry?
If you give the trustor, if the trustor gives,
Yeah.
the respondent might say, well, he wants me to have it, that's why he gave it to me.
Yeah.
And if I give it back, that's
Yeah.
not very nice.
Yes. Yeah, actually, we had an experiment in which people returned even though they did not give, and their interpretation was, oh, they must be so poor.
Yeah.
We have to give them something. So that's clear. But I think the interpretation in the positive domain is much more complicated. In the negative domain, if you make a lousy offer, you never make a lousy offer in order to get rejected. So that doesn't make sense. So for that reason, that's quite different. So we study blameworthiness and action. Yeah.
That's not true.
What's not true?
In some of the anthropological fieldwork, people made very low offers so they would get rejected. And the experimenter, afterwards, having lunch or something, he said, why do you always get rejected? He said, well, I'm a rich cattle owner and you're a poor graduate student, and I don't want to take money from you.
Okay.
It really happens.
Okay, that's nice. That's very nice. And they play the game in a different way than we intend. That's
But that happens a lot in the anthropological literature.
Okay.
But some people won't play the ultimatum game because we're going to give you $10.
Yeah.
Well, I don't deserve $10. Why are you giving me $10? You know?
Okay, so yeah, there are always exceptions. There are many motives. We try to, let's say, classify the most important ones. Yeah, so when we study blameworthy, we have nice tools, we study punishment patterns. So that's essentially what we do. Now, when we think about when is a person blameworthy or responsible for a particular action, then there are two facets that we can look at. So a person did a particular action, then one question is this action actually intended? Or did the person have something else in mind? So is it really what the person wanted? So that's with respect to intention. And I will show you a study on side effects that illustrates in intention, the concept of intention. And on the other hand, you can think about whether the person causally responsible for the result, or is, let's say, other people, or let's say nature, other influence responsible for what comes out. So responsibility, and we will study that responsibility in decision chains. So what I'd like to do in the remaining of the talk is link theoretical constructs of intention and responsibility with actual behavior. Part 1 is about intention, part 2 is about responsibility. Let's now go to the intention part. It's a paper with very nautical. The paper is motivated by a story that Joshua Knob asked people in Central Park in New York. The story goes like this. Vice president of a company went to the chairman of the board and said, "We are thinking of starting a new program. It will help us increase profits, but it will also harm the environment." The chairman of the board answered, "I don't care about harming the environment, I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start the new program." So the company started the new program, increased profits, and the environment was harmed. Now the question is, did the chairman of the board intentionally harm the environment? Now, who thinks he intentionally harmed the environment? Who thinks not? Okay, now let's go to another story. Vice president of the company went to the chairman of the board and said, "We are thinking of starting a new program. It will help increase profits and it will also help the environment." The chairman of the board answered, "I do not care about helping the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start a new program." So the company started a new program, increased profits, and the environment was helped. Now, same question. Did the chairman of the board intentionally help the environment? Who thinks he helped intentionally? Who thinks not? Okay, so here we have a clear answer. No, in the first case we had a not so clear answer, let's say more balanced answer, but there is a clear difference. Here is just what Josh Knob found in the harm condition. About 2/3 thought it was intentionally, and in the help condition, almost everybody, as here, thought it's not intentionally. So there is a clear asymmetry between how you assign intentionality in these two cases. Now, so the most frequent answer was actually it's intentionally harmed, but unintentionally not harmed. So, Josh Knob summarized that people are willing to blame others for seeing side effects that are bad, but not willing to praise them for seeing side effects that are good. Then there was a huge discussion about this concept that is relevant. So, what drives this result? So, for instance, Knob said, yeah, it has to do with moral values. So, in the case in the case of harm, it's really morally bad. In the case of help, it's not so clear. And then he introduced more of these vignettes to show that that's the case. I will show you another idea that was Marjorie, who said, Now, actually, the point is, in the case of helping the environment, there is no trade-off. Why shouldn't he help the environment? That's okay. But there is a trade-off in harming the environment, and for that reason, that is driving, that makes it intentional. And so he illustrated with another vignette. Joe was feeling quite dehydrated, so he stopped by a local smoothie shop. It has a difficult word. A smoothie shop to buy the largest size drink available. Before ordering, the cashier told him that if he bought a mega-sized smoothie, he would get a special cup. Oh, I omitted the difficult word. A special cup. Joe replied, I don't care about the cup, I just want the biggest smoothie you have. Sure enough, Joe received the mega-sized smoothie in a commemorative cup. Was the difficult word. So, okay, so now you can think about, was it intentionally to get this cup? And here it's a question, he has to pay $1 more. And now is the question, did he intentionally pay the $1? And here, what we find, he intentionally paid the $1, but he did not intentionally get this cup. And the same here, so the familiarity with the previous experiment is that here we don't have a trade-off. Okay, he gets this cup again, that's okay. Here he has to pay $1, it's really a trade-off. Should he do it or not? And for that reason we have higher intentionality here than in the other situation. So that was the trade-off hypothesis. Yeah?
In the previous example of the environment, the reason why I think the second guy who claims he doesn't care about the environment really cares about the environment is because any profit maximizing manager, CEO, like these Tom's shoes and so forth, it increases your sales if you pretend to care about the environment. So for anyone who cares about the direction, it's the right thing to say that you do. So the fact that he replies he doesn't care for me must mean he's a real purist and he must care. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
But otherwise, there's no reason for anyone to say I don't care.
Yeah, that's true. So, but this wasn't a public statement. So, and I think we have to not go to take it too literally. Yes.
What if I just changed it and said, we have a new program which will be profitable, but it will put some other businesses out of business? Did he intentionally put them out of business?
Yeah, that's a nice story.
Actually, we have.
The answer is clearly no.
Actually.
That's a very nice story.
Yeah, actually, we will come to that story. We will come to that story. Actually, not yet. At the end of that part. Now, so there were different ideas about what's the underlying reason. Now, our question with regard to the no question is there an asymmetry in this assignment of praise and blame for positive and negative externalities, and so we do an experiment and then we try to think about what kind of concept of intention can capture these differences. So what NOPE finds is a way how people think about intention, and the question is now, what is it? What people really think about intention that has a meaning that that's perhaps generalizable. Our experimental approach was to create the same setting as in the questionnaire and let third parties reward and punish, and then we compare reward and punishment. Now, how is the perception of this story? Actually, we have a quite powerful firm. Probably the environment is considered as weak, and we have strong externalities and not so strong positive weak externalities. And how did we implement that? We implement the firm as an active agent who can decide something. We have the environment as a passive agent which acts as a distributor. And what we did is we have a starting point where people start. So here we start in the herd condition, we start with a firm and environment same condition, 50 points, and you can hurt the environment, taking away 20 points and giving the firm 10 points. So that was the herd condition. And then the redistributor can transfer points between firm and environment. So that was the idea. I will explain why we did it that way. And now in the, this is the herd condition, and now in the help condition, we created the same end situation if the firm hurt or helped. So there was also 60-30 as here, but the firm could now help in the sense that the starting point, so we varied the starting point. So here he could just add 10 points and get 10 points as well. And we had a third condition, no externality, that was just, there was a 60-30 and the person could redistribute. Now the idea was that we compare the situation in which there was no externality with these other externality situations, and we compare the redistribution in three situations. And we define reward and punishment relative to this initial state. Here are a couple of points concerning the procedure. I think I will just skip that and just show how much transfer was taken away in that situation. So one guy had 60 points, the other had 30, so it's not unnatural to assume that they just equalize payoffs. So that's equality. Actually, if there is no side effect, if they can just redistribute for any reason, what we find, that's more or less what they do. They somewhat respect, but very little, the initial endowment of the firm. But what we also see is that if the firm was hurting the environment, the firm was punished, which we measure as this comparison, and was helped, somewhat helped, but very, very, very little in the case that the firm was helping. So what we find is essentially a confirmation or a replication of the results of NOVE. So we have here, we have punishment in that situation, but we have almost no reward in that situation. So that's essentially what we found. Okay, that's significant. Now, we thought, okay, what could drive the result now from an economic perspective? The firm is very strong. There are strong negative, weak positive externalities. So what changes if also the positive externalities are strong? What changes if the environment is now the environment is now on the strong side? Yeah.
So in the experiment, there were actual players. There were players.
There were players. Yeah.
What if the environment was a charity that cared for the environment, and the firm was actually, I don't know, Microsoft, right?
Ooh.
So wouldn't that give like more real, because okay, then it's just a label in front of firm and in front of the environment. So, but I know that there are people behind it, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, actually, our point is we want to generalize NOPE's vignette to another situation, and to a situation that we can vary more easily. And for that, and that was exactly the reason why we implemented and brought it in a more controlled situation. And if you have just these payoffs between different people, that's actually a quite easily controllable situation. If you think of add charities and so on, then you have the evaluation of the charities. It's much more complicated. So actually what we wanted to do is add control. I think the other question is also relevant, but has different target behind. It's different target idea. Okay, so what we did, sorry for the animation. What we did, we just changed the end state. So here the environment is strong at the end and the firm is poor. In the herd condition, again here, firm could gain 10 points and lose, the environment lost 20. Here in the health condition, we had here again the 10-10, and here we had the no externality treatment, which is just the 30-60. So that's one of the situation, and the second situation here we varied that helping was really strong. So here we had an additional treatment in which helping was really strong. So when the firm earned 10 points, the environment got 40 points in addition. Now let's look at the results. So what we find is that, so here is the old result with respect to reward and punishment. We find that in this perception 2, so when we turn it around, so when we make the environment weak, then this effect that harm is punished and reward is not, is actually completely disappears, and in the situation, sorry, I think the stars should come, yeah. And if we have this third condition, we can even turn around this effect. So people are rewarded for the conduct and not punished for the bad side. Now, are these results relevant for the node effect? The node effect actually is about intentionality, not about blame and praise. So perhaps what we measure is something completely different, has nothing to do with blame, with intentionality. So we thought, okay, we should now come back and try, knowing now what's perhaps going on, develop a vignette that can do something. And so actually it's close to the suggested vignette. Vice president of a small fast food restaurant went to the chairman of the board and said, we are thinking of launching a new burger. It will help us increase profits, but it will also harm McDonald's next door. Okay, chairman of the board answered, I do not care about harming McDonald's, I just want to make as much profit as let's launch a burger. So the company launched a new burger, increased profits, and so on. And then did the chairman intentionally harm McDonald's, and we had the same situation with helping McDonald's. That was a little bit more difficult, so we gave a kind of explanation why that could be the case, for example, due to higher pedestrian. So, what came out of that? Yeah, actually, it was, we could not really turn it around, the effect that we had before, but what we found before, we had this 51% who attributed intentionality to harm and not intentionality to the health condition. Now it was 18, but nevertheless, on the other side, there was, so we couldn't really flip it around. So that it was still the case that harm was slightly more considered as more intentional than the help. Yeah.
I have a problem with the way you stated.
Yeah.
Suppose the president said, well, we want to maximize profits. I feel sorry that we're hurting the environment, but that's not what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
We have to maximize profits.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, people will, in other words, I think often people will want to hurt the guy, not because he's
Mm-hmm.
intentionally anything, because he said a bad thing. I don't care about the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I would, there's a confound then. Because if you give people a chance to punish, they don't care what you call it, intentional or what. They want to punish him. So I would change the statement to get out this idea that he's a bad guy who doesn't care whether he hurts the environment.
Yeah, I think one, I completely agree. In this vignette, the point is, if you say you don't care about the environment, that's definitely bad.
Right.
No, if you say you don't care about the environment when you harm the environment, that's definitely bad. If you say I don't care about the environment, if you help the environment, okay, that's okay. That doesn't tell anything about you. But actually, it's exactly what comes out when we go to the next point. But you
Very
say,
similar. And I do think that intentionally, kind of, it has to be against your interest.
yeah. So actually, I agree. So I agree with
Otherwise,
you.
it's not credible.
Yeah. Now, and that's related to this trade-off hypothesis. And I will now make the point. I think I try to make the point clear. So I hope that we can get to the kind of solution even. When we think about the no effect and concepts of intention, then we have to make one point clear, and the first point is the action intentional? And actually, the action is always intentional in the context of an experiment. You did this action, okay, did you tell? Yes, of course, you did the action intentionally. So the intention is about something else. And actually that's not interesting. So the question is the side effect intentional? That's slightly different. And the question is actually, is the side effect, is it the goal of the agent? Is the side effect actually motivated? And that's part of the intention. And in that sense, is it part of the utility function? And I think if the side effect is an externality, then an intentionally kind, we have to think about whether the person is intentionally kind or not. And I would illustrate that in the Levine model. I come now a little bit more in detail of the Levine model. In the Levine model, people have parameter concern for others. You can think of it social value orientation, whatever. They just have a concern for others. And you do not only have a concern for others, but you have also concern about the concern for others of the other guy. So you have a concern AI, but in your utility enters how much you're concerned about the other and how much other concerns about others, and this both is positive. So that means if you have a nice guy, you are nicer to a nice guy than to a mean guy. That's essentially what it gets. Now, when we can group people into antisocial and social, so let's say we have the pro-social guys, here we have the antisocial guys, and then in the herd condition, not everybody hurts. So in the herd condition, and that's exactly what you said. So if you say I do not care about the environment, actually that means something. Because there are some people who care about the environment and they wouldn't harm the environment. So that's actually informative about the guy, and for that reason these guys actually they deserve punishment, and we can say they did it intentionally. So they intentionally harmed the environment in the sense that harming the environment was somehow in their utility function. At least it was not helping the environment, was definitely in their utility function. And so that means that's the concept. And when we think of the help condition, actually more or less everybody will help. So that's not very informative, and for that reason, why should they deserve help? They do what's completely clear. So that's actually the idea of the Levine model. And the robust implication that we get from that is the fewer people do something, the fewer people do a bad action, the more they deserve punishment. The fewer people do a good action, the more they deserve a reward. So that's a robust prediction from the Levine model. So that means when the firm is strong, fewer people harm than here, and for that reason these guys deserve more punishment or are assigned more intentionality to the action than those. Intentionality now is kind of measure of how strongly they have these negative attitudes. And the more friendly people are, the less they are. I would like to come back to the experiment that I presented before, this A2 to 8 offer. Actually, also in that situation, when we look who made this A2 offer, who made the A2 offer, and actually, unfortunately, I realized that really years after it was published, when you look at the alternative 5-5, then 31% make the A2 choice. So there are all the few who make this. There are really few jerks, and they deserve a high punishment. While in the A2 to 8 case, okay, actually many make the A2 offer, and that's much more acceptable because many more do it. In the A2 offer, of course, everybody makes it, so it's not at all it's not informative. In the 10-0 A2 offer, also everybody does it, and here even the nice people do it, and in that case they deserve even less punishment. So that's actually quite fits nicely to that idea. Now, when we go back to our perceptions, and then what did we see? We had in this first perception there was punishment, and in this third perception there was a reward. Actually, when we look in the situations, that was actually the situation in which fewest people chose this action, so chose the bad action, and in that sense they deserve punishment most, and the reverse is true in this health condition. So we get, let's say, a kind of confirmation in this a qualitative confirmation of that. Now when we go back to the philosophical approaches, so that the philosophers had different concepts about why people could make these distinctions between intentionality attributions. When you think about moral situations, if an action is moral, then not everybody will do it. And for that reason, it could be deserve more intentionality. But I think the most important thing, or the nicest thing, is the trade-off hypothesis. If there is no trade-off, everybody does it. And it doesn't tell you anything about the intention. But if not everybody does it, you remember that was the story with either you get an additional cup or you pay an additional $1 to get something. And if there is a trade-off, not everybody does it, and for that reason you attribute more intention to having done that. Now what's interesting in my view is here that we can think about intention for other actions. That's clear that we can think of intentions for other actions, but we can use actually the same concept for intention in that context as in our context of social preferences. So that's what I think is nice. Okay, and that's also related to the third concept of Wright and Benson, that the attribution of intention determines praise or blame. Actually, it makes sense that those who have a motive to be unkind, they deserve punishment the most. It makes most sense to punish them. Actually, in criminal law, we can discuss it. It's a little bit, perhaps even different, but that's actually a completely different level. Now, conclusion of this first part. We replicated these no vignettes with the language in a language independent way. So that was actually the idea of us. And we could replicate the results of NOBE and but we could also vary situations, and we find that the concept that's based on this Levine idea is actually quite consistent with the way how people attribute intention in the node question. Now I want to come to the other side, so yeah.
Before you move to
Yeah.
I have a question about
Yeah.
the sample you're using here.
Yeah.
In psychology, you have an effect that is called the fundamental attribution error.
Yeah.
They see it so often that they call it fundamental, and it describes that if someone does something that is not good for you, you always attribute to something negative. So that guy is stupid, or he has negative preference, or something like this. And even though they thought it's really fundamental, at some moment they found out when they do the same studies with elderly people, they don't find it anymore. They mainly find that effect with their students, because they are just not experienced. They haven't been in many situations, and they haven't experienced that sometimes shit happens, or you're forced by the environment to do something. So what kind of sample did you use, and might this have affected you?
Yeah, we use just constant students, so that's small place, narrow with respect to age. The vignette of No were done in Central Park. I would assume that there are, I don't know, people who can at least walk for some distance, but apart from that, I would say that the sample was definitely less selective. It could be that this is relevant. Nevertheless, we have here quite robust results in that respect. So, but okay, could be interesting to look at whether that grows out. People grow out of this problem. Other question? Okay, now I would like to go to this responsibility question. This joint work with Björn Bartling from Zurich.
I think in law, I mean, I'm not a law specialist at all. Tomorrow, Daniel Chen of the law chair is going to be here. I think in law, the term intention is only applicable if you can distinguish between two intentions. If they're perfectly aligned intentions, like in this case, it's for profits and for nature, you wouldn't actually use the term intention for either one if you can't distinguish the two. I think that's very important.
Well, if you're a firm, you can intentionally maximize profits, even if other things are coincident with those profits.
Yeah, sure, but you cannot then say, well, all you can conclude from that is that they did something that was consistent with both intentions. But you can't say they did it for profit maximization or intentionally to help
I think you can.
the environment.
That doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, firms make profits, that's what they do. They're side effects, sometimes they're in the same direction.
Sure, but
To
I'm
say,
saying
well, we can't say the firm is trying to make profits because it also gave an ice cream cone to
we
Little
can
Joe.
talk about this later. I said in court, I said in law, in court. I can't hold you responsible for one in particular if I can't distinguish between the two intentions. That was my
No, I think you're right. You cannot. You cannot prove it. You cannot prove it. You need in some sense more information. I think partly, but if you think of criminal law, then you definitely try to infer intention. For instance, how people committed crime, whether they did other crimes, and so on and so on. And there it's extremely important to get exactly at
So it's manslaughter or accidental manslaughter.
Yeah, exactly. And their intentions play an extremely important, and there people try to find it out, and of course it's sometimes it's not provable that intentions matter, or what kind of intention matter. Yeah.
I think this is a good comparison with the law, because in law you have this concept of negligence, or if it's like the degree of how negligent your action is can probably be attributed to what we call intention. If your action is grossly negligent, then you say, well, you almost intended to these consequences. So we see in criminal law that, for example, if you're driving recklessly, you can get punished really hard for that, because it's almost like you intentionally kill someone if you drive recklessly. So I guess there in law you call it negligence, and here we can call it intentionally just not trying to avoid the consequence.
I think I think it's a very important discussion. I think that negligence is sometimes also related to the concept I will come now to responsibility. Sometimes, but negligence. So I would interpret negligence as you don't have being careful in driving in your utility function. So in that sense, it corresponds to the intentionality concept that we have here.
So if I say I don't care about the environment, I'm negligent that something might happen to the environment by my actions.
Okay, now responsibility. Yeah, when you think of the disaster of Costa Concordia, it's somewhat one could discuss who is really responsible for that. Could be the manufacturer of the ship because the ship shouldn't tilt, the shipping line because there were missing regulations, bad governments. Yeah, no, it's okay. I also thought that. Okay. I speak as if I don't have a microphone. Shipping line. They could just that a hiring competent captain, and probably most people would say the captain is responsible, neglects many things. Now, what we did is we wanted to know who is held responsible in a decision chain. In a delegated decision, who is held responsible for the case. And does this affect how people delegate in the first place? And third point, now we had a discussion about how can we formalize intention. We also thought how to formalize responsibility. I will skip that. I will just mention that there are some people who think shifting responsibility works. For instance, Machiavelli, and for instance, chief restructuring officers who just go to a company, do the bad stuff, and leave. What we do, we use punishment as a measure of the responsibility attribution. We show that responsibility can be shifted and that this responsibility shirking is an important motive to delegate decision, and then I will show a small model that can work. Our experimental design is very simple. We have a fair allocation and an unfair allocation. Fair allocation is all 4 players. There are 4 players, get 5. And an unfair allocation in which player A and B get 9 points and these poor player C's get 1 point. The decision, we had in total 4 different decision situations. First, most simple decision was just the dictator game. So A decides fair or unfair. That's it. Second situation, A can delegate. A can delegate the decision to B because the interests are completely aligned. It's not a very risky decision. So A can delegate to B, and that's it. So it's a big data game with delegation. And then we added punishment stage, so to both situations. So it's a third element. And we had some kind non-standard punishment technology. So C could just spend 1 point and had then 7 points to deduct from the other players. Actually, we let one player C. We randomly selected one of the players C to do the punishment in order to avoid that both players think, oh, okay, the other will punish, so I don't have to. And we also allowed player C's to punish each other, which provides us just as a kind of benchmark for punishment. We used strategy methods for player C. I think that's the crucial point here on the procedural details. The rest is just standard. Yeah. What is standard prediction? Okay, that's boring, rationality and selfishness. C does not punish. B is unfair. If B fears punishment, then of course B will fair, but B is definitely unfair if there is no punishment. A is unfair unless A fears punishment, and in particular A is unfair if there is no punishment, and does not delegate in the no punishment condition, because the only thing A could risk is that B makes a mistake. Now, of course, we know some people are fair, we know it from dictate game. We know that people somewhat want at least to appear fair, and finally people do not want to be treated unfairly, so we should observe some punishment, and for instance, people could be generous just voluntarily, and people could shift, let's say, the decision in order to get a rejection that they do not want to exert themselves. So first, decisions of A and B. Here, the blue is unfair, red is fair, no delegation, no punishment, so that's just a dictated game. About roughly 2/3 are unfair, 1/3 is fair. When delegation is possible, some people delegate, but the picture does not change that much. It becomes a little bit more unfair, but all these differences are not significant. So, because there are not so many people on that side. When there is punishment, the picture changes quite dramatically. That's definitely significant. So now it's about 2/3 who are fair and 1/3 who is unfair. And when we go to delegation, then now we have a lot of delegation going on here. So many people delegate. In the end, we have about the same percentage who are unfair as we have without delegation. So that doesn't change too much. Actually, not at all, or almost nothing. But there is a lot of delegation going on. More than half of A's delegated. So 55% delegated in that situation. So that's the situation of A and B. But the interesting thing is actually, how do people punish? So that's really the thing we were interested in. And first here, that's the dictator game. So 9-1 is just the unfair choice. There are 2 9s and 1-1. Okay. And what we see is that A is punished. So that's not really a surprise. There is some punishment of B, there is some punishment even of the other C. But yeah, that's what we observe. There is also even the stupid thing somewhat happened. Yeah.
Was that a one-off or was it repeated?
No, one shot.
One shot.
One shot. Okay. Really, one experiment. It took, I think those without punishment took about 30 minutes and the other 45 minutes. So it was quite. So that the instructions were not very short, but then it was really easy. If it was fair, then of course there was almost no punishment. But you see even here, there is some people who can reduce the other's payoff. Okay, let's see. Now, when delegation was possible, we find essentially the same pattern here. You could think that perhaps B is punished slightly more. Okay. If A was fair, almost no punishment here. Now the interesting case is this case here. So A delegates, B is unfair. Who is blamed now for that? And actually our punishment technology has the advantage that you spent this 1 point and now you can deduct points from the others, but up to 7 points. So it's an odd number, so you have to decide somewhat. So it makes sense that we will observe here a difference and actually do. Actually, mainly B is punished. I had a discussion with George Lowenstein, who thinks that these people are completely stupid, and if they would think long about it, then they would punish A because somewhat A initiated the bad outcome. I disagree because we have later a model that explains the stuff very well, but it's an open discussion. Perhaps if people think long about it, they have a different concept of attributing responsibility. Now the third point here is also a question, actually A was not very nice here. But it turned out that nothing happens. What happens here? No punishment at all. Also A is not punished at all. So A gets completely away. Okay, so that's now the results, and when we look here at the distribution, so we see here the situation in which that's the situation, that's this part, so this situation in which A was, in which A was unfair, so there were some B's who were punished. And here is when A delegated the decision. There is one guy, so one George guy. There were some people who punished A slightly more, but most people punished either only B or B more than A. So that's clear, and of course we have some guys who do not care or selfish and do not punish. Now, when we look at the motives for punishment, now what could be the motive for punishment? So one motive could be outcome. I just do not like when we have the bad outcome. Of course, we would observe here high punishment for A and for B, and in an intention-based model. In an intention-based now, based on the two alternatives, yeah, this is unfair, this is fair, so this is really bad, this is okay. B didn't do anything, so that's okay. Now, outcome here, of course, we have punishment here. We should have, this is really mean from A. This is, at least he gave the other guy a chance, but it's somewhere in between. At least these two are the same. And here we should, but B definitely is completely intentionally outcome. Now when we compare that with the average punishment, what's a little bit, what deserves explanation, so to say, is that outcome cannot explain why B is not punished here. So, but that's clear. So that intention can easily explain it. What is difficult for intention is to explain why A is not punished here. So both of these models have some problem. So what we thought is, yeah, couldn't it be related to responsibility? And then we tried to think about, yeah, what means responsibility here, and could we find a more formal idea? Actually, you can think of responsibility in different ways. You can think of prospective responsibility, so who should get the decision rights. But what we are interested in is retrospective responsibility, who caused the outcomes. And there are also here a couple of different notions. Is it the person or luck? And in the decision chain, actually, there is in the book of Cameron, he just thinks that the last moving player is the person responsible, which I think is perhaps not the complete explanation. So what we suggest is just a measure of causal responsibility that looks at how large was the potential influence of a particular person. Let me explain it at our game. When we look at A, at the beginning, the probability that the bad outcome results is 39%. Now, when A decides, then A affected the outcome to the bad to 100%. That's clear. So it was the only person who had an influence. Now, in that case, here, the influence of A was very small. So the influence of A, it slightly increased the probability, but actually the influence of B was much larger. So here we would end up with a responsibility rate of 2% and 98% for B. Now, and here of course the bad outcome didn't result, so there is nothing attribute, no responsibility to attribute. Now we did implement this responsibility measure. Funnily, we got exactly the same result in a slightly different way. Of course, when we look here, this responsibility measure is extremely unstable. So if we would have here 41%, A wouldn't be responsible at all. And that's a little bit implausible. So what we did, we asked other people, so another crowd, what do we guess? What is happening in this game? So how do A and B decide? And then we took these belief data in order to calculate individual responsibility measures, and then aggregated these responsibility measures, and that's what I show you here. And what we find is actually a quite nice rank correspondence of these measures. And of course, if you have data and you try to think of a measure, then it's easy to find a measure that fits the data. So we thought, okay, we should add something in order to be a little bit on the safe side, that it really makes sense. So we did two things. We added a die treatment in which we replaced player B by a die. We also just did the good thing with 60% probability. So that was one treatment. Then we think that you cannot shift the responsibility to this other die, but it's not so clear whether you are responsible, because it could be that you actually improve the situation in the sense that that the die is worse than your initial behavior. And then the second treatment that we did is when we change the choice set that A has, how does this affect responsibility? And so we did a treatment in which A can only be fair or delegate. And of course, then delegation is intentionally mean, but A has also more responsibility in the outcome. And that A has more responsibility is shown here on this graph. A has now only the possibility to delegate or to be fair, and for that reason, the probability that the bad outcome results increases much more by the decision of A than in the treatment before. And for that reason, in that case, the responsibility attribution towards A is higher than in the treatments before. Now, how did we compare now these different models? We just used regressions with the model predictions as regressors. The outcome is just a binary thing, 1 for unfair, 0 for fair. Intention, we use just 1 if the action taken increased the probability to the unfair outcome by that, and values in between if more actions are possible, and actually we look just at the probability that the bad outcome results. And responsibility, we have the 0 for fair outcomes, and we had the corresponding responsibility attribution with these beliefs that we have gained from these experiments. And what we did is just, we did individual regressions where we just used this one model as regressors, and there we can look at the R squares. So actually we can also look at the significance, but I think interesting is the R squares, and we see that responsibility has actually the highest R square. If we take all models together, then responsibility, as we see, is related to intention, and for that reason the intention effect decreases dramatically. So that's, but actually there is not so much to gain from outcome and intention, so responsibility captures actually quite a lot what we get in our experiment. I can show you a little bit other stuff if you like, but I would conclude here. We have conclusion with respect to this random device. Responsibility shirking is a strong motive for the delegation. of decision rights. So we have seen this 55%, and we have seen that this simple model of responsibility captures punishment, the punishment pattern in this delegated decision situation. Now, I would like to end with a question: why do people care about intention and responsibility? And now, first, punishment could be altruistic because it's costly and creates incentives for others to behave well. And of course, it should not harm people who need no incentives. And in that sense, why should you punish people who actually didn't want to do that? Or why should you punish people who do not deserve it? So you should only punish people with bad intentions, and you should punish those with highest probability. That means you should punish those with the highest impact on the outcome. So you should, if you can influence people, you should influence those people who have the highest potential impact on the output. And that makes also sense. And of course, nature cannot be incentivized. So it makes sense to create incentives for those who need the incentives, so to need their incentives to be corrected. So that's why you punish both bad intentions, and you punish people. It's good to punish those with the highest responsibility in order to create incentives where you have the highest impact. Okay, so now final conclusion: intentions and causal responsibility are important. Concepts can be formalized, and formalization, that's nice, correspond to concepts suggested by philosophers, which I think is actually also nice. Now it's the question whether we just rediscover stuff discovered for years by philosophers, or whether we can put it on even more solid ground than just on thoughts. So on formal models and empirically backed formal models. And the punishment pattern that we find, we could now say, because this punishment that is really influenced by responsibility and intention is reasonable, it makes sense to think also that this punishment could be altruistic in the sense that it's really not just for revenge reasons, but to create the incentives that make sense. Thank you.